Okay, so it's the Queen Elizabeth class. And it's one of those interesting questions which has come up in Patreon which actually made me think. And honestly, when I first saw it, my temptation was to say, well, there are so many books about these ships, and, you know, surely this question's already been answered many, many times. And then I started going through those books. And they're all looking at it from their perspective. You've got technology, you've got politics, you've got a couple of books with just sort of naval strategy-ish sort of approach to it. None of them are looking at them in the round, the full context. And I thought, ooh, this could be a book topic. And then I thought, Alex, you're already writing 4 books. You have plans for roughly 40 more worked out. When in all the names of holiness are you going to actually reach a point you'd get round to writing this? And then it was a case of, well, if all I was doing YouTube and public history and writing, probably let's be generous to myself, let's say 8 years, and that's being generous to myself in giving me lots of time to do things and actually time for a bit of a social life. Now let's add in the reality that I do teaching and all sorts of other jobs to provide me with enough to keep going, and because I enjoy some of them. And you're probably talking about 20 years. Okay. So that means I should probably do the videos, right? Probably quicker. And then it won. And I thought, okay. It won the popular vote. It won the Patreon vote. Let's do this. And where would I be without the shameless book plug? Or the shameless merchandise plug? Both I do quite regularly. Because, again, historians got to eat. I would love to say we can run on the pure ether of knowledge and understanding and learning and history alone, but the reality is we need food and liquid, even though currently, due to dieting, that most of that liquid is water. Viva la lives. Then I get my iron brew. Still debating whether or not the Twitch counts as another live stream, in which case I can theoretically have 2 more iron brew cans a week. But, you know, that's a debate going on, and that is question A for today. Does the Twitch stream count as a third live stream? In which case, am I allowed, therefore, by my own definitions and rules, to have 2 more cans of iron brew a week? I'd just like to hear a sort of sampling of what my viewers think. And the other question I'm going to say today, but I want you to watch the whole video before you start to answer the question, is whether or not you think they got it right with the Queen Elizabeth class. Now, there's a reason you're going to have to listen to the whole video the whole way through to answer that question. Because I'm going to try and give you everything in the round. And I'm going to give you areas in the round and discussions. And you're probably going to go on off and go read some more and do some more sort of research yourself before you answer that question. But it's an interesting one to think about. Did they get things right with the Queen Elizabeth class? And that is the ultimate question. Did they get it right? So let's see. This is today's question. And these are the Queen Elizabeth class. Look at them. 13 inches of armour in their main belt. 8 inches of armour in their lower belt. 6 inches of armor around their sort of casemates area, 11 inches of armor on all sorts of on their turrets, 6 inches of armor on the conning on the aft director position, 11 inches on the forward conning tower. That's a huge chunk of ship. It is. And there's 5 of the 6 are actually built. And, well, I might at the end also bring up HMS Agincourt to discuss her a little bit. So when they are laid down, this is by the end of 1912, when they're sort of laid down, what's going on in the world. The dreadnoughts. And it's honestly worthwhile considering this in context, because you have to think about the fact that America has dreadnoughts under construction. France has dreadnoughts under construction. Italy has dreadnoughts under construction, some very good ones, and some actually in service. Not sure where the Italian bar for dreadnoughts in service has disappeared, but this is my old slide from my old dreadnoughts 1905 to 1914 video series. So yeah, that one disappeared. Perhaps I got the wrong slide out from the drafts. Sorry. But it's just to give you a context of all these powers are dreadnought powers. All these powers have vessels under construction. Even little Australia, down here. Japan has dreadnoughts in service. 1912. And this is the Queen Elizabeth class. Now, I'm going to start off with, they are, according to their own designer, about 900 tons overweight for what they could have been, or rather 900 tons of wasted weight, due to the reality of them being originally designed for coal, then being designed to have oil, and the changes around. And you can see a spacing in the design which clearly could have been space for a 5th turret, but instead has engines there. And that is an interesting scenario. Okay, how do you fit in engines and have a 5th turret there? Could you? Displacement 32,590 long tons. That's 33,100 tons in normal. And 33,790 tons, or 33,260 long tons in deep load. Length 196.2 meters. Beam 27.6 meters. Draft 10.2 meters. They are slightly deeper draft. They are heavier than they were planned to be because of some of the changes made in their design, in their construction process. 24 water tube boilers. Please note that's not small tube. They are just water tube boilers. With 2 steam turbine sets powering 4 shafts with 75,000 shaft horsepower. Top speed of 24 knots. In practice after Jutland, some of them were more practically 23 knots. And a range of 5,000 nautical miles at 12 knots. Armament, 8 15-inch guns in 4 twin turrets, 12 16 single 6-inch guns, and between 12 and 16, depending on the ship, single 6-inch guns, and 2 single 3-inch 76mm AA guns, 4 21-inch torpedo tubes. Waterline belt 13 inches. The area considered most likely to get hit by incoming fire. Let's see. This is their predecessor. So you can already see that at 25,000 tons, 29,500 tons, full load, these are a lot heavier than the Iron Dukes. $189.8 meters, so a little bit longer, Not much, but a little bit longer. Beam, 27.6 meters to 27.4 meters. So they are longer, proportionally narrower, but they're still slightly beamier than the Iron Dukes. Iron Dukes had 18 water tube boilers and managed to deploy 29,000 shaft horsepower for 21.25 knots. So you have to ask yourself whether 75,000 shaft horsepower from 24 water tube boilers, so just an extra 6 boilers, and giving you what, roughly 2.5 times as much shaft horsepower to give you an extra 2.75 knots is really worth it. Or a range of 7,780 nautical miles at 10 knots. There's a range of 5,000 nautical miles at 12 knots. 13.5-inch guns. Now, of course, if we consider the normal of our working out, usually it's go up a level, go down a third of your guns. So, well, no, how do I put this? If you want equivalent weight of broadside, if you were, let's say, starting off with quadruple 12-inch, then you'd have roughly triple 13.5-inch and a double 15-inch. So you can make the claim that your 8 15-inch guns are the equivalent of 12 13.5-inch guns. So you could make that claim. Not necessarily a sensible claim, but you could make that claim. Again, that's very rough rule of thumb back of a envelope mathematics. Belt, 12 inches of armour. Bulkheads, 8 inches. Turrets are the same, 11 inches. And decks, 2.5 inches. Barbettes, 10 inches. Barbettes between 7 and 10 inches. Depending on where you're talking about. Nevada class. Contemporaries. I know it's always good to bring in the contemporaries. And honestly, let's consider it. The fact is, as I've mentioned before in the Dreadnought race videos, the fact is it isn't an Anglo-German naval race. It's an Anglo-German naval race in terms of numbers, but in terms of qualities and capabilities of ships, it's an Anglo-American-Italian race. They're having the tech race. They're the ones pushing the envelope in terms of gun size. If you leave it up to the British and the Germans alone, the British will produce the world's most numerous fleet of 12-inch armed dreadnoughts, and the Germans will produce the world's most numerous 11-inch armed dreadnoughts, because the British don't need to produce more than a 12-inch armed dreadnought to fight the 11-inch armed dreadnoughts of the Germans, and the Germans believe their 11 inches are capable of taking on the world. Whether they are or aren't is neither here nor there. That's what you would get. The ones pushing the sizes are the Americans and the Italians, because they're going for the quality versus the quantity approach. And so the British have to respond to them as well. And the British are also sort of looking at the quality as an idea of maybe making things cheaper themselves, because can they make something which is so much more powerful than the Germans will just go away, which is why the British do produce the 13.5-inch, because they suddenly got all these people producing 12-inch ships. Well, the Americans at the same time are, as the British are producing 13.5 ships, start producing 14-inch gunships. And they're producing 10 14-inch guns in 2 triple and 2 twin turrets. Okay. So they have 10 14-inch guns. Now let's leave the rest of it to one side, because the fact that the Americans have the Nevada with having 2 steam turbines and the Oklahoma 2 triple expansion steam engines is... Oh. I know why they're doing it, I know why, the logic behind it, but logistically it's just a case of, oh, why would you do that? You're building literally 2 battleships, they are supposed to work together in evolutions, and you've given them 2 entirely different engine setups that are going to respond differently, which is why I've put top speed for both was roughly 20.5 knots, range roughly 8,000 nautical miles at 10 knots, and I would say Oklahoma gets the 8,000 nautical miles at 10 knots. But I don't think Nevada does from her turbines. I don't. And I would say Nevada can maintain the top speed of 20.5 knots for a lot longer than Oklahoma can. From what I've read. Of course, I've never actually been aboard these ships, so, never got that chance to go aboard them. So, they might have achieved the amazing thing of getting 2 sets of engines which have completely different shaft horsepower and completely different operating bands to provide them with pretty much the same capabilities. I'd be amazed, and that would be a feat of engineering and architectural skill which frankly should be shouted from the moon. But please note the armour belt, between 8 and 13.5 inches. So one of the things you often hear about the Queen Elizabeth is they have the thickest armour belt of all ships in their time, and you sit there and go, well, that's a 13-inch armour belt. Yeah, it covers a large area. Yes, it's massive, but that's a 13.5-inch armour belt. And the barbettes are 13 inches. And it's 27,900 tons... 28,900 tons in full load. 12 water tube boilers. Top speed is 20.5 knots, so let's be honest. They're not going to have fun with versus a Queen Elizabeth class. That's going a Queen Elizabeth class, even one which is limited to 23 knots, is going to be able to dictate the entire battle to those to its opponents. Barring an incredibly lucky shot, they're going to be able to dictate that battle in its entirety. But again, there's a lot more dreadnoughts in the world at this point, and Britain is starting to really hit its stride in terms of production, the sheer volume of production it's capable of. Pennsylvania, contemporaries of 1913. Again, they've got that good belt going on. Arizona and Pennsylvania class. 12 14-inch guns. That's the Americans' quick reaction. And let's be honest, 12 14-inch is probably equivalent to 8 16-inch. There's a triple turret going on here. I'd say 12 14-inch is more than a match for 8 15-inch. And they're 14-inch 45 caliber guns, whereas these are, if we go back to them, 15-inch 42s. Which, again, much at the standard of the British, does give them a capability going on here. This class all used turbines, but they were comparing Curtiss versus Parsons. So American versus British turbine sets. Getting the top speed of 21.38 knots, 31,500 shaft horsepower. (6,070 nautical miles) at a cruising speed of 12 knots. And again, pretty thick armour. Bayern class. Eight 15-inch guns. Armoured belt between 6.7 and 13.8 inches. Conning tower 15.7 inches. Turrets 13.8 to 3.9 inches of armour, depending on where and turret you're talking about. All pretty good. And by the way, I'm using the date of them being laid down to structure these ships, because once a ship's laid down, yes, you'll make some modifications in its design and construction, as happens with the Queen Elizabeth class, in terms of going from coal to oil, almost back to coal again, then back to oil again, which is why it leads to 900 tons of weirdness in their ship designs. But, you know, broadly speaking, when it's laid down, that's when you're capping off the technology, because you're having to order all the long lead items, everything's being organised. So 1913 technological point is what you're dealing with. For the Queen Elizabeths, are they revolutionary for 1912? It's the question. And then we have the Revenge class, which are both more efficient around their oil fuel plant, have the same waterline belt, have the same armament, but have 18 Babcock and Wilcox boilers, supplying 40,000 shaft horsepower for a taupe speed. Oh, good lord, these really did come from old drafts, didn't they? They came from old drafts with spelling mistakes. Of 21 knots. A range of 7,000 nautical miles at 10 knots. Someone's described them and said the Queen Elizabeth class are the A class battleships. And the Revenge class are the B type battleships. I always say it's the Royal Navy wins the Anglo-German naval race with the laying down of the Queen Elizabeth. With the Revenge class, they're merely making sure everyone else knows it. Especially once you get 8 of them. You are basically just saying, right then, we're replacing our earliest 12-inch ships. The moment these come into service, if the war hadn't been happening, the dreadnoughts and the immediate 12-inch class, 12-inch gun armed ships, which had come in after them, the 8 of them, would have been probably not scrapped, but more than likely retired to reserve, or maybe given to places like Canada, etc. They, after all, would only been 6 to 8 years old by the time they came into service. These would have come into service by 1915 if the war hadn't started. So you could have handed them off to Canada, you could have handed them those older ships off to Canada, you could have handed them off to Australia, South Africa, or India, or New Zealand, and they'd have been perfectly happy with them. They'd have given them dreadnought capability, that'd have given you more capability across the Empire, and it wouldn't have been a threat to the US Navy or Japan or anyone. It would have been, though, to an extent, a deterrent. Because, yes, you can win against them, but you can only win against them if you actually bring your battleships. Anything else isn't going to enjoy that fight. Especially not if they've got upgraded fire control. So that's always my sort of suspicion, is what happens if you have the 8R class enter service before World War I begins. Because that's really where they fit. And then them and the 13.5-inch ships become a fairly solid battle line for the British as they push on. Dreadnoughts in the world. So, some points to discuss when we're talking about the dreadnought race. Britain always outpaced German construction. Well, the trouble for Britain is, though, that as much as they outpace Germany, they have to be everywhere. It's the same thing as I come up when I'm talking about planning for World War II and all those scenarios. Britain has a global empire. It's dependent upon global maritime trade. And it has to be strong everywhere, or at least have the ability to be strong everywhere. It doesn't have to be strong everywhere all the time, because there's not war happening everywhere all the time. Hopefully, if you're diplomatic scenario, and oh good lord. But what you want is to be able the ability to project strength everywhere. And this is what's feeding into the Queen Elizabeth class when it's being built. Okay, this is the decision process going through the Queen Elizabeth class, but there is other factors. If you make a leap with the Queen Elizabeth class, they are going to give you victory over the Germans in the Anglo-German naval race, because the Germans don't have the infrastructure willing to invest the money. Because if they invest that money in the navy, there's not going to be the money for the army. And one of the reasons the British cranked up the naval race to the extent they did was to turn into a direct financial competition in Germany between the army and the navy, because that was a competition the navy was never going to win. The German Navy might be strong enough to take on all comers, to win all options in terms of fighting abroad against anyone. They could be built. They could justify being built to whatever strength they wanted to. However, the moment they start competing with the Navy for with the Army for funding, the moment the Navy starts competing with the Army for funding, the moment the Navy starts taking funding or looking like it might be taking funding from the Army, it's lost its political battle. It doesn't matter how much in favour the Kaiser is. The Army will always win over the Navy, because the Kaiser will always love the Army more than the Navy. It's just the reality of the situation. And yeah, as said, there are a lot of different nations building ships, and this all factors into the naval race. And it all factors into the Queen Elizabeth class design, because if you factor in them, they are going to allow you to win the Anglo-German naval race. But they're also going to be another tier on in the Anglo-American-Italian naval race going on, which is the qualitative one. And where are they going to go with that? Where are the Americans going to go? Well, their immediate answer is to go for 12, 14-inch guns. Well, that's fine. But there are problems with that one. And what do they go for next? Well, the Americans have been jumping 12 and 14-inch, so the Royal Navy's going up in 1.5 inches to try and keep, to an extent, that technological race as calm as it can. But the Americans are jumping up in 2, so where do they go from to 16? That's where the Americans are going to go to for their security. So the Queen Elizabeth class. They still look rather good, don't they? Even in this World War I version, rather than when they've got the Queen Anne's mansion, which, if we consider, this is sort of Warspite. This form versus this form. They still look pretty darn good. Admittedly, that's managed to trank it down to a single funnel. Again, if we go back to the R class, the Revenge class, they've taken it down to a single funnel. A little bit of working, once you've got oil burners and you've got all the systems organized properly, you can make the design so much more efficient. 900 tons is the estimate of the designer, but I think he's underselling himself. I think he could have made 1,200 tons of difference on the Queen Elizabeth class. And he could have used those 1,200 tons for other things. They could have had more armor. They could have had more engines to get more boilers to give them more speed. All sorts of options. So, what are the factors in terms of design? Well, you have a lot of cooks in this broth. You have a lot of cooks. You have the Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, looking bonny and young about there. 1911 to 1915 is the Lord of the Admiralty, and he has many, many ideas, including his obsession with oil fuel, which he gets from Lord Fisher, who I could put in as another picture here, but is mainly out from the outside lobbing ideas in, so is not really part of the formal design process. We have in the construction and the period of their design and construction, we have Watts and we have Tennyson Dennicourt as directors of naval construction. So Watts is more associated with them really than Dennicourt, but Dennicourt does come in and make some changes. So Watts is this gentleman on top, and then this is of course Dennicourt. Third Sea Lord. Well, we have no photo of Charles Briggs that I can find, but we do have Jellicoe, who's the third Sea Lord 1908 to 1910 when they're doing the design studies that will lead to the Queen Elizabeth class, and is also still very actively involved as various fleet commanders commenting into the construction design of the Queen Elizabeth class, and is one of the people who is persuaded when doing the studies that small tube boilers will not be available in time for the Queen Elizabeth class, so that's why they don't go with small tube boilers. We'll get into that though. And then of course you have Charles Briggs, and then you have Gordon Moore as the third Sea Lord. So these are who are involved in the day-to-day running and decision-making. Now, people then tend to bring up First Sea Lords and go, hang on, this is the First Sea Lord time. Surely they have the most power. Well, First Sea Lord is the first Sea Lord, and they are the head of the service. However, let's put it this way. First Sea Lord has to deal with operations and coordinating all of them around the world and all the information coming in about them. Daily intelligence briefings about what other people are doing. Dealing with politicians on a regular basis, making the case for the naval budget in the House of Lords and the House of Commons, all of those options, and then on top of that, you're presuming they have time to micromanage the design of ships. Now, when it comes to Chatfield and the King George V's in the run-up to World War II, yes, you can, because there is literally one class of dreadnoughts under construction. But if we consider, at the same time as the Queen Elizabeths are being built, there is the King George V's, there are the Iron Dukes, there are the Revenges, and there are a whole stream of battle cruisers, including HMS Tiger, all under construction at the same time. Yes, the Queen Elizabeths are arguably the most important, but the fact is, from a First Sea Lord's perspective, that's what you have the Third Sea Lord for, and that's what you have the Director of Naval Construction for, and I only need to get involved when I really have to get involved. So a lot of the design process goes through those two. That's what they're there for, and that's what they do. However, if you have a First Lord of the Admiralty, who is very, very much a micromanager on certain things, you might well send him off to deal with them. And that is when you have a specific problem turn up. Third Sea Lord John Jellicoe, very strong personality. Will argue back with Winston, quite happily. Gordon Moore, strong personality, will argue back with Winston. Charles Briggs, absolutely brilliant mind. Arguing back with Winston is not what he does best. And the thing is, Winston Churchill has many, many faults. He also has many good qualities. They don't always balance out. But one of the things that does come throughout history is whilst he might not always enjoy having people who argue back with him, he always respects people who argue back with him. If you don't argue back with him, he tends to start disregarding your entire opinions because he believes you just don't have confidence in them. And if you don't have confidence in them, they must be wrong. Now, we can agree and disagree about whether or not this is the correct methodology to approach when dealing with people. Myself, it doesn't tend to be my opinion to follow when I'm dealing with people. If they're not arguing back, that could be A, because of the quality of the arguments I can put across, but B, it could also be because they just don't like arguing. However, you have a small problem. You don't know that. So sometimes, you actually have to help the other person make a strong argument against you. The other night, I was out for dinner with a friend, and we were talking about whether or not cows are, and having cows. We were sitting eating beef burgers in a burger restaurant, and actually debating about whether or not cows were good for the environment and good as a whole. And I was going, my view is, from my family background, they are because of the other net benefits. And it's a case of it's a net benefit versus producing just entirely one thing. Because again, it's good for crop rotation and things and far more natural than putting nitrates and other things in the soil. I'm not getting into that here. But the point was, I was also giving them the information about, well, the reason you have to put cows inside, especially over the winter, and you have to put them in barns, etc., is because they're now getting so heavy, because we've bred them to be so large, to be such an efficient meat producers, especially beef cows, that they actually sink down into the ground in certain parts of the country when it gets too wet and damp, and they actually get stuck. So it's you bring them into concrete and you feed them artificially rather than feeding naturally because of what we've done to them. I gave them that information because it improves their argument. And because, therefore, them having the information makes me have to think through my argument more clearly. It argued against my point, but is worthwhile them having. Because it then, by improving their argument, improves my argument. If you have a scenario where you are able to out-argue someone, because they do not have all the information, and you have the information, including the stuff against you, it behoves you to give them that information in a manner which allows them to use it to make you argue the best you can. Because if they're arguing the best they can, you can argue the best you can. But some people just do not like having an argument, or a debate, or a discussion. Call it what you will. I would call it an argument because I'm a historian, but I don't mean an argument in terms of shouting, going, I don't like you. No, nothing like that. But it's an argument in terms of the argument you are making, the case you are building. That scenario. So you need to again think about that when you're talking about the Queen Elizabeth class and their design and construction. Because what is going on? What is the argument? What is the discussion going on? What are they trying to build? Are they trying to build the world's best battleship? The super dreadnought. Again, keep away from the propaganda. This is something which comes up a lot. Again, recent comments about on the blockade video, one to do with the War of 1812. Oh yes, the British were always bolshing and pushing. No, But you have to remember there is a lot of propaganda put out by the British that the blockade is the strongest it can possibly be. Isn't in reality. But the British put out that propaganda because it's very good for them in terms of the blockade. And then when you're talking about the War of 1812 specifically, there is a lot of American government and Americans who want the war because they think the war's going to be a quick and easy win, who are making the case for war, who are going to trumpet up events in terms of the British interference with neutrality when they know their own merchant ships are pushing the envelope and edge of neutrality as much as they can to maximise their profits, because they're going to, because if they can make a lot of money, to make the case for them going to war. So you have both sides where the propaganda is being pushed for different reasons. And that provides a lot of information, a lot of stuff which a lot of historians fall down the hole of, because it provides a very, very effective narrative. When the reality is the blockade was never quite as strong as the British would like to present it as being, and the British were never quite as effective at searching neutral ships as they would hope to be. Yes, they did manage to find some, and yes, the Americans did push it, and yes, there's also the press issue where you have the fact that you would have sailors on a ship which might be even a British ship, but they'd claimed they were American sailors, but they were American citizens, but they spoke English. They had no real proof, because this is pre-passports or anything like that they were Americans, and they speak English, they sound like their fellow English sailors and Englishmen. They could just be lying, you don't know. And that causes issues in itself. And even some of the cases who are sometimes claimed as, oh, this was an American who was impressed by the British, and you look in the history and go, I'm not sure they were American. They were certainly claiming to be American, but they don't. What little data we can find about them suggests that they were British, as much as you can be British or American at that time. It's a far more fluid scenario than it is today, and you have to realise that, and the complexities that then creates, because you don't have the information databases and things you have today and take for granted. So beware of trusting sources in the past, is basically the answer. Now, gun selection. This is a big one. Now, the 15-inch Mark I is developed as, what there is a debate as to whether it's called the 14-inch experimental or the 13.5-inch experimental. I've put the 14-inch experimental in quotes there because, well, that is what I see branded around on the internet more often than not. I don't think so, because that wouldn't make sense for the British to be producing they've got the 13.5-inch gun in service, so a 14-inch experimental doesn't make sense for the British to jump it to. And the British understand trying to make the case for it not to make the case in a scenario they don't want people to be sort of running up at them over. They also know the jumps, and the Americans know the jump. They know the British did the 1.5-inch jump, and the Americans did a 2-inch jump, so they went ahead. But there is a selection process that goes into this. These guns are developed over time, and they are a potential bottleneck. Now, the British could have done a legitimate 3-inch jump. They could have gone up to 16.5 inches rather than 15-inch. They could have done that. But think about it from the British perspective. If you are doing a full gun selection, if you go up to 16.5 inches from 13.5 inch, you have certainly then won against the Germans, because there is no hope of them getting up anywhere close there anywhere soon, because that would be a whole level of research beyond what they have available. Britain has all these companies: the Ellswick Ordnance Company, the Armstrong Whitworth, William Burnmore and Company, Coventry Ordnance Works, the Royal Gun Factory, and Vickers. All of these gun manufacturers are capable of development and research, and all of them can help and be and can be brought into a program to develop a 16.5-inch gun or a 15-inch gun. Your pick. 15-inch gun, it's probably going to be quicker than a 16.5-inch gun because it's less of a jump. but you can theoretically jump to a 16.5-inch gun. However, think about it from the American perspective. You've started building 14-inch guns. If your next jump would be to 16-inch, if the British got 15-inch, 16-inch, that's fine. But if the British jump to 16.5-inch, what's your next jump? If you jump to 16-inch, then the British are still ahead of you. You've just jumped up to 16-inch guns. You've got all these new guns, all this stuff, and the British are still bigger and more powerful than you. So have the British just won the tech race? Then you go for the 16.5-inch guns. But what happens if you consider the American arms development system and all the scenarios they've got going on and the various industry and capability they're building up? What happens if they kind of think, right, and we're going to jump to 16-inch and we're going to go straight to our next horrible point, and they go to 18-inch? Okay. That's going to then have to cause the British to have to consider a jump as well. Their next jump will be to 18-inch if 1.5 inches, or do they go to 19.5 inches? As you can see, if you jump too far, 15 inches is a jump enough to win. You're going to be able to produce more 15-inch battleships than the Germans can ever manage. But if you jump to 16.5, yes, you can still produce more of those than the Germans can ever imagine. Probably actually produce a 16.5-inch gun, whereas they would take it forever to get to a 16.5-inch gun because of where they're starting from. But you've now given yourself another problem, because the Americans and the Italians are going to jump as well. And where are they going to jump to? Now, I haven't included the various other vessels that come about, but broadly speaking, you need 104 versus 186. You've got 186 barrels produced for roughly the 104 needed by the Hood, Queen's class, Revenge class, Renown class. Of course, the Courageous is also needed, and the various monitors as well. So you have a few more than that sort of needed, but, 186 barrels produced. 34 by Ellswick Ordnance Company, 12 by Armstrong Whitworth, 37 by William Beardmore and Company, 19 by the Coventry Ordnance Work, 33 by the Royal Gun Factory, 49 by Vickers. So you have got 4 manufacturers there who are all well over 30 guns produced. But that's your real options. You stick with a 13.5-inch gun, but then the Americans are producing 14-inch guns, and the 13 jump to the 13.5-inch gun hasn't persuaded the Germans to stop their building. It hasn't caused them to have any demurrements at all, any issues. You need to do something about it. You have to remember, the original branding of Super Dreadnought was applied to the Orions and the 13.5-inch guns. They were the Super Dreadnoughts. It didn't work. It wasn't big enough jump to cause the Germans issues, and especially the issues between the German army and the German navy in terms of their fighting over budget. So turret selection. This is another option. And please note, what have I brought here? There are triples and twin turrets going around. The British have triple turrets and twin turrets in their design profile going through. So again, theoretically, you could have gone with triple turrets. Now, you've just heard me talk about earlier, the first reaction of the Americans to the 15-inch guns was to 12 14-inch guns, 4 triple turrets. And you also heard me say that if I'm building the equivalent of 8 15-inch guns, that works out of the equivalent of 12 13.5-inch guns. So if I'd had 12 15-inch guns, That gives me what? What does that give me? That gives me a lot of firepower. Also gives me the equivalent of broadside equivalent to that of 16 13.5-inch guns. But again, if I've done that, what have I just done to the fine balance of the quantitative race with the Americans and the Italians? Have I pushed them too far? What would the Americans produce? Because they can make an easy change to go up to triple turrets, 4 triple turrets. That's an easy change, an easy one to predict of what they're going to do with 15-inch guns if you've got something which has got 8 15-inch. When they had something which had 10 14-inch. Yeah, that's an easy one to predict. They got to that. But if you produce something with 12 15-inch guns, well, turning up and going, well, we've got something with 12 14-inch guns, doesn't really sound like reassurance. So they might be forced to push further more quickly, which could erode your strategic statement more quickly. As it is, it pushes it back a couple of years. So again, you have to think through, what turret do you select? What turret is worthwhile for you? And again, the British often get this, people go, oh, could they produce a triple turret? They could produce a triple turret. They did. They had the technology, they could do it. They had the designs, there is all sorts of work available. It's actually the debates me and Drakenfell have regularly on HMS Agincourt, or whether or not she's a 12 15-inch gunship or she's a 6 18-inch gunship. It's a scenario to consider. But the point is, twins or triples? Which do you go with? If the British suddenly go with triples, which they could do, they're suddenly raising up their firepower far more per ship. Again, people tend to go, well, they stuck with twins because that gave them more survivability, but you're still talking about 4 turrets. So, 4 turrets is just as survivable as 4 turrets. 4 triple turrets is just as survivable as 4 twin turrets. You just have 50% more firepower. Boilers. Here is the really big thing. I think small tube boilers. I think the power per ton would have made a huge difference if you had small tube boilers. I think oil-fired small tube boilers would have given the Royal Navy an absolute edge. I also think these ships would have been the Queen Elizabeth class would have been 28-knot ships. But again, you want these ships in service. There is a high risk of war. Everyone knows at this point there is a high risk of war. So you're going for as fewer bottlenecks as possible. This is also another factor with the 15-inch guns, by the way, and the twin turrets. You've got twin turrets under construction. They're a very proven design. A triple turret, yes, you have designs available for it, but it's going to be something which you haven't put on a British battleship before. If you go for the 16.5-inch gun, that's a bigger leap than the 15-inch gun, so there might be more bottlenecks in that. There are going to be bottlenecks in producing the 15-inch guns, but how many? There'll be more if you leap that much further. So basically, with again the small tube versus large tube boilers, if you go for the small tube boilers, that's a leap. It would probably work, and I'm sure it would do, but the large tube boilers are the known quantity, and you've got them in widespread construction. So you are trying to build the most advanced thing you can that wins the competition with the Germans, but also build it in a time that's available should any conflict break out, because there's no point having a wonder weapon you can't use. And also build something which doesn't cause your qualitative races you have going on to explode out of control. Mainly because no one wants the cost on the latter. Not because war is likely between Britain and America or Italy and Britain. No, it's not. War between Japan and America is a strong possibility. It's a strong possibility from, well, for almost their entire relationship in the early 20th century. But which could, of course, theoretically, if America got any allies, drag the British in, because, of course, the Anglo-Japanese Naval Agreement, which was, as long as it's one power versus you, we don't have to do anything. But if either of us end up in a war with multiple powers, we join in. Very interesting alliance. Basically, if it's a 1v1, it's on you to do your own fighting. If, however, it turns into a 2v1, then we're joining in. So if it was just a war between America and Japan, the British would probably sit there on the sides going, we trade with both of you. Ding ding, let round one begin. But, again, they've gone for a conservative choice because it's going to get them the ships into service. So here is the theoretical Queen Elizabeth Maximus, okay? 15 16.5-inch guns in 5 triple turrets. 28 knots plus top speed, probably closer to 28 knots than that. And I've put roughly 45,000 normal displacement based on what I worked out on the beautiful thing that is Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts. But please note that was me doing my own peccadillos of 14.5-inch belt armour, 14.5-inch turret armour, conning tower, which was about 13 inches, and I don't like conning towers, but I get fed up with them getting dinged in UAD saying you are now not able to use your admirals. So the reality is different. The reality wouldn't be that big or that heavy, but you are talking something which is probably closer to probably has about another 20 odd meters, 20, possibly 30 odd meters on the length of the Queen Elizabeth class originally. Now, the British could have built this. There is nothing there they couldn't have built and started they couldn't have developed and started building. They didn't have the capability there, the infrastructure. Again, go back to the sheer number of companies they have that can produce 15-inch guns, which are the of the oomph in terms of having to be able to produce them. The amount of technology and infrastructure to support them. The British have 6 companies they can produce them, and all of them can produce double digits of them. They could have produced this. But think of the impact it has. Think of the impact on the Washington Naval Treaty, post-World War I. If you've got the Queen Elizabeths with 16.5-inch guns, the Revenges with 16.5-inch guns, the Renowns with 16.5-inch guns, Hood with 16.5-inch guns, what are the American response to the 16.5-inch guns going to be? As said, it could be 16-inch guns, but it could well be 18-inch guns. In which case, you have a Washington Naval Treaty where everyone's banking in on 18-inch gun ships as your limit. And think about the tonnages. Think about how big Hood would have to be made. If you're building with the same armament as the Queen Elizabeth class, in this scenario, the Maximus, and all the investment you'd have had to do, and all the costs. When in reality, these were enough. They were enough to do their job. Yes, there are too many cooks in the broth. There are too many cooks doing all sorts of different things in them. And this does lead to many, many weird scenarios in terms of the Queen Elizabeth class. The fact is, if the Queen Elizabeth class had been built to the same size with the efficiency that the R's were built, in terms of their oil design and all those oil power design, etc., you would be dealing with a ship which was probably 2 to 3 knots faster, and more than likely they could have found space for a lot more upgrades in the interwar years. These ships are, though, roughly at least 2 knots faster than the Bayans, and they outnumber that class 5 to 2. And the Bayans, I would say, are more a response in qualitative terms to the Revenges than they are to the Queen Elizabeths. And when you start putting in that, you go, well, Revenges are broadly speaking the same speed as the Bayans, and they outnumber them 3 to 1. And then you have the Queen Elizabeths on top. The Queen Elizabeth class and the Revenges are the Queen Elizabeth class, the winning of the Anglo-German naval race. The Revenges are the we're making sure everyone knows we've won the naval race. That's what they're about. And they're enough to do that. But they are a very conservative revolution. Calling them the first fast battleships, to me they're not fast enough to be the first fast battleships. Calling them the first super dreadnoughts, technically the Orions were branded as that, but I would agree it's far more likely that the Queen Elizabeth deserves that title than the Orions. Their 15-inch guns were capable. And again, you could have gone back to just a triple turret scenario and you've gone with 12 15-inch guns. And again, that would have caused enough trouble. Because if you go through any of those scenarios of making this class the Maximus, barring, I think, the small tube boilers, honestly, I think the one scenario where you can get away with it is the small tube boilers, because if the British had put them in, the American response would have been small tube boilers on their battleships, and that would have been fine. It would have been a case of, yeah, the British have built their battleships very fast, but the British have got battle cruisers as well, and the British have always had fast capital ships versus us. That's nothing which is going to worry us in terms of our qualitative, in terms of our strategic thinking. It doesn't worry us that the British have faster capital ships than we have. Would have petrified the Germans. So there's that sort of one thing where I think actually you can make a legitimate argument the British should have gone for the small tube boilers. But I think if you do go back to that theoretical Maximus, 16.5-inch guns, yeah, I haven't plucked that number out of my behind or thin air. That is what some of those companies, Ellsworth Ordnance Company, etc., are working on a 16.5. They have a theoretical plan for a 16.5-inch gun, just like they have a plan for a theoretical 15-inch gun, which is paid for and developed under this experimental, which I'm fairly sure is the 13.5-inch experimental, but lots of sources say, and I said the prevalent one on the internet seems to be the 14-inch experimental, But that doesn't really fit with the British design philosophy at the time, and would kind of been see-through, but, you know, maybe. But there's the other sources which say 13.5 inch experimental, so I'm sitting there going, it's one or the other. But you build that, yes, you've got the world's fastest ship. You've got the world's most powerful ship. You have also just added heat to... You've won one race, and you've decimated them, to the point at which they're probably not going to be competing in terms of dreadnought construction with you. They're going to turn to something else, which could change the rules of the game again. And you don't want them to change the rules of the game. You want them to compete with you and fall apart doing it. You want them to... That's the thing when you're judging versus the Germans in the Anglo-German naval race. You want the Germans to compete with you, and the very act of competing with you to break them and cause them to stop funding the Navy completely versus the Army. You don't want them to go, we can't compete on dreadnoughts, so we need to build something different and do something different. Because that's not going to be the result you want. That's the scenario. So again, you go that far. You produce this, you have produced something which is amazing. Lord help anyone who comes across this beast. You know, if you want to simulate it going around in 1914, 1915 against any threat that comes up against it, if it's built. 15, 16.5-inch guns, top speed roughly 28 knots, a little bit over I aimed for to make it work. So I kept aiming for 28.5 knots. That thing is not going to be stopped by anything. There is nothing that stops that. But there's also that is, what is the American response? What is the Italian response? What is the Austro-Hungarian response? Again, they're also pushing the edge of the technology. Because they're competing with the Italians. And they're producing some really cool stuff. And that's going to set up a whole new race. Instead of you winning one race and then having the other race being so the Americans are building that, okay, right, and we'll build a new one, a couple of them, and then they'll build a couple of theirs, and then we'll build a couple of ours, and then they'll build a couple of theirs, and then we'll build a couple of ours, which is a nice, fine thing to do. It's just part of normal peacetime for a navy to have a technological competition going on with other navies. It's what you do. It's basically bragging rights. You have it for as long as they produce theirs and you produce yours, and when they have theirs, they have the bragging rights, and you have yours and you have the bragging rights, and it's a way of actually releasing tension and releasing stress and lowering the likelihood of war by actually having that kind of competition going on. But a quantitative competition, especially at the range of the Anglo-German one in terms of distance, that's when you get heat and nastiness added into it, and that's when you get problems. But you could have caused real problems. If you think about the America, the debates going on, the Tillman battleships and all the other things, imagine what the Tillman battleships would look like if the British were producing something with 15, 16.5-inch guns and coming into service in 1914. Imagine what the reaction would have been. And the British understand that. So the British are trying to walk a fine line with the Queen Elizabeth. They want to win one race, they don't want to add acetylene to the other race. However, then comes HMS Agincourt. Now, here is the debate that comes into it. Was she going to be a 12, 15-inch gun ship? We know she wasn't going to be a normal one. Or was she going to be a 6, 18-inch, or maybe even 8, 18-inch gun armed ship? Now, the interesting point I put together here is this. 18-inch guns appear. They're already being built, and they appear. And are fitted to the Furious. They are fitted. They are cut down to be fitted to Furious. We know they are cut down. They were longer. And those guns, when I say we know were cut down, we know they have to be modified. And the obvious scenario, and from some of the descriptions I've read at the time of people at the time, they look like they've been cut down at the end. So they're cut down when they are in Furious, which means they are being designed for a much bigger ship and a much more stable ship than Furious. Furious has singles, but again, the British produce at least 3 of them. Now, you do not have 18-inch guns going around for no reason. You're not investing in development. Again, if you think about it, you can't jump to 16.5-inch from when the Americans have jumped to 16-inch since you jumped to 15. Jumping to 16.5 is just not enough clearance. Not for your battleships. It doesn't. It sounds like, oh, we've got 16.5. It just sounds petty and doesn't work. So next echelon up for the British in the terms of the tech race is 18-inch guns. It's the next one which works. And if you think about it, that's also the next jumping point for the Americans, from 16 to 18. And it's a way of capping off that naval race, because 18-inch guns is probably the largest that are practical with the technology they have available at the time. And going in terms of rate of fire and actually being a viable warship. You might end up with 1 or 2 ships with bigger guns than that, but 18 inches is probably where it ends up. We also are fairly certain she was going to be fitted with small tube boilers. How can we be certain on this? Because a whole host of small tube boilers appear for Courageous and Glorious after she's cancelled. I wonder what they were being built for. So Agincourt, the 6th Queen Elizabeth, is a really interesting option. Yes, she could have been going to have triple turrets, but those turrets don't appear anywhere. They're not used for anything. Or she could have been going to have 18-inch guns, which do appear and are available. Now, there is the other option, that she was going to be designed to be really interesting and would have had 3 triple 18-inch turrets. That would just make her incredibly scary. But no. What we do, I would say myself, I think more likely the 6 18-inch guns, because, again, Renown and Repulse, the form they take, it doesn't come from nowhere in the Royal Navy. We know we know when they're talking about it, they've already said that, well, 6 guns is about the limit. And you sit and go, well, where's the studies for the 6 guns with 15 inch? There's no studies for 6 guns with 15 inch. So that means they were studying something else that they were working out with 6 guns. Now that's my argument. And again, I do point out that I have got to do a lot more archive research to be even anywhere certain of this. The stuff I've had has given me a strong suspicions, but I've got nothing I can throw to as a smoking gun to prove it. And as I said, my best friend, well, one of my best friends, one of the 4 of us who go away to Australia, go to Canada, and hopefully going somewhere else soon, and sort of announcing all that and all the plans we've got for coming forward for that. Drac puts forward that he thinks it's going to be a triple turret vessel. He thinks it would have 9 or maybe even 12 15-inch guns. Which he could do. He could be right. But we don't know. We need to do some research, and we need to find out. But it's an interesting scenario, because again, it's the 6th Queen Elizabeth. It's the 6th. And would she have been a technological jump? Would she have been the real first fast battleship? Who knows? But I think, again, it's interesting that she would have been a one-off. Because, again, if she's built at the same time as they're building the R class, the Revenge class, that sort of starts setting the terms of the qualitative race going on. We'll build small numbers of these really super powerful ships while most of our fleet will fit in that category. 15, 14-inch category. Maybe 15, 16-inch category. Whatever makes you happy, but that's what we're happy to do. As a sort of unspoken agreement. We'll let you have the vast majority of your forces be 16-inch ships, but you'll have less than us. And both of us will have these peak units of 18-inch ships, but we'll have more ships because they're 15-inch, because we have more space to cover, and then we can find a nice sort of happy medium of peace. Who knows how it could have worked out, but this is another factor you have to consider in the whole development of the Queen Elizabeth class. The fact is, the British could have gone for something bigger and something nastier. And the 18-inch gun for the Furiouses, that's an even more interesting story once you start looking into the reports and the information, because there is a line of history which comes through and is often quoted, which is, on the face of it, ultimately very reasonable explanation. But once you start looking into the exact details, the plausibility becomes a case of, no one is randomly developing and building an 18-inch gun completely on spec with no plan for it. Completely, yeah, we just happen to have an 18-inch gun system we are developing. Yeah. 18-inch stabilized gun for naval operations. It's just something you're randomly developing prior to World War One. Reasonable. You can agree that there is a reasonable case being put forward. Plausible, no. Anyway, that's what we've got coming up. Ooh, the Battle of the Rice Boats and the Battle of San Nicholas, Revolutionary Battles, and Bombardment of Elwood. And on Sunday, of course, the patron suggestions go live. Or I might do it today. I might do it actually on Friday. I'm not sure. I'll do it I'll probably do it Sunday, so probably tomorrow. So with Brew Ships 103. And yeah, the Battle of Yarmouth I'm going to announce now on 19th March, and I'm going to put it because I've been told it's Mothering Sunday. Nice way, it's Mother's Day in the UK. So I could do a live for all of you, or I could still be breathing. Live or breathing? I think if you would like to have more videos from me in the future after the 19th of March, I think it's probably more sensible if I take that day off and treat my mum to a lovely day of videos, of movies, maybe a trip out to lunch, if I can go out to lunch, and chocolates. I think that's probably more of a sensible course of action. Because, yeah, she brought me into this world, but that means she can probably also take me out. Year of Technology, what have we got coming up? Ooh, next week it's marine diesels. That's going to be fun. There's a history of those. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and take care.